Welcome back. 3.2 K-selected and R-selected species. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify differences between K-selected and R-selected species. So to accomplish this, we're going to describe the characteristics of K and R-selected species and explain the effects that invasive species have on K-selected and R-selected species. So first, before you even read these words, let's look at some K-selected species. We've got a gorilla, we've got an elephant, and we've got a wolf. So think about what those species might have in common. K-selected species are those that live in predictable and stable environments. They're typically long-lived, and they have a stable population size, again, because they are long-lived. There's a lot of competition. They typically reproduce later in life. They care for their young. You can see in all of these pictures, you've got parents caring for their young. They have a modest number of offspring, and they have a larger body size. On the flip side, we've got our selected species. You can see right away that these guys are a lot different. They typically show up in rapidly changing habitats, short lifespans, highly variable population sizes. They usually reproduce at a young age, don't typically care for their young, and they have high numbers of offspring, and they're a smaller body size. So what does this mean? This means that our selected species have a much higher biotic potential than K-selected species. And this biotic potential is the unrestricted growth and the maximum growth of a population. So again, we have our selected species over here, like this frog. They have a higher biotic potential because they can produce so many more offspring, and they can change numbers so much quicker than something like a humpback whale, which may produce one offspring every few years and provide significant amounts of parental care. So biotic potential, we've got that unrestricted growth. Just going to keep reproducing and reproducing and reproducing and on and on and on and on. Versus something with competition. So I said earlier that there was competition in the K-selected species because they're bigger, they live longer, they need more resources, so they just can't afford to reproduce like those R-selected species do. But don't think of this as an either or. You're not either an R or a K, it's a spectrum. So some species could be more R or more K, and it may depend on the conditions, it may depend on the part of the life cycle that they're in, but generally we can describe species as being more R or more K species. So an example of this would be a sea turtle. Sea turtles have large amounts of young. That's an R-selected species trait. They don't provide any parental care. Again, that's more towards an R-selected species. However, they're larger and they don't reproduce as often, and they live for a very long time, all those traits which would make them seem more K-selected. So how are these species impacted by invasive species? So remember, we talked about specialists and generalists. Specialists would be more of our K-selected species. They can't respond as fast to changes because they don't reproduce as much because they're larger. Whereas our R-selected species are their generalists. They can respond quickly because they produce more young, they can adapt to more habitats. And so we see the same effects that invasive species have. So K-selected species are more adversely affected by invasive species than R-selected species are, and also invasive species tend to be those R-selected species. Because they can take over more habitats, they reproduce quickly, they can outcompete the native specialists who aren't always producing as many young and can't survive as many different habitats. So take, for example, the lionfish. You can see in this graph in 1985 they saw their first lionfish here off the coast of Florida. But a lionfish can produce 2 million eggs per year. That's going to put us solidly as an R-selected species. And by 1999, they were up the coast. By 2005, they were all over here. And by 2015, they're basically taking over the Gulf of Mexico and up the eastern coast. So, to summarize, K-selected and R-selected species differ in the number of offspring and the frequency of reproduction and in the amount of parental care they provide, along with some other traits. This causes our K-selected species to be more adversely affected by invasive species, the R-selected species to be less affected, and they generally are the invasive species, and that K-selected and R-selected is a spectrum. So remember, you're not either or, you could be somewhere in the middle, and that can change for certain species depending on environmental conditions or the stage of the life cycle that they're in.